In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the rear brakes on this Hyundai Santa Fe. Pads and rotors, let's install these brand new TRQ brakes. Now with a 21mm socket, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then pull the wheel off. Remove the wheel. Let's remove the bleeder screw cover, pop it off, and then use a 10mm socket or wrench, break it free. Work it back and forth if it's a little stuck. Brake fluid should start coming out any second. There we go. And at this point, I'm going to stick a screwdriver through the caliper right here and compress it. This will do two things. One, it'll start pushing the piston back, which we have to do anyway. And two, it will more easily allow me to pull the brake caliper off of the pads when the time comes. Okay, there we go. That's good enough for now. Gonna make sure there's a steady trickle of fluid coming out before I snug it. Tighten it up and just leave it like this. We will be coming back to this in a little bit. Now use a 14mm wrench or socket and remove the 2 bolts that hold the caliper onto the bracket. With these off, you should be able to easily remove the caliper. It's not good to let it hang by the brake hose, so I'm just going to put it right over this control arm. That should hold it on nicely. Let's remove the brake pads. Just slide them right out. They should not be very stuck in here. The 2 14mm headed caliper bracket bolts are here and right here. You don't necessarily have to pull the control arm off. If you have a wrench, that'll get in here. That's how I'm going to do it. Once again, 14mm, break them both free. I'm not going to completely remove this one, just going to unthread it a little bit. This will make sure to hold the caliper bracket in place while I loosen that one. Stick a wrench down here. It's going to be very tight, so it'll be about 1/8 of a turn at a time, unfortunately. As you unthread this, you might notice that the rotor has to come off at the same time if you're doing it this way, because you cannot remove the bolt. So I'm going to give this a few more turns, and then we will have to start removing the rotor at the same time as removing the bolt from the bracket. And then we'll have to start removing the rotor at the same time as the bracket, so that the bracket can basically push off of the bolt as it's being unthreaded. And I think that time is right about now, because there's nowhere for it to go this way further, so let's take the rotor off. These rotors are held on with 2 Phillips head screws. Let's remove them both. If you don't have an impact driver to drive your bit, you can use an impacting screwdriver or take a punch it right in the center. That sometimes breaks it free. That is if it's stuck. Hopefully yours are not. There we go, take both of these out. Now the rotor may still be stuck on the hub. It looks like it is for us, so I'm going to take a hammer it from the side, and that should pop it off. There we go. Sometimes you might have to go from the back side. Now continue removing both of the bolts on the caliper bracket until you can pull everything off. This top one is pretty much out because the bottom one is broken free. I can remove this one, set it aside, and continue unthreading the bottom one. Once you get the bolt loose enough, you should be able to unthread it by hand, and then the caliper bracket should want to pull off of the knuckle as well as the rotor, kind of all at the same time here. There we go. There's the bracket. Set that aside and remove the rotor. Once you take the rotor off, hopefully yours still has this rubber boot. Pop it off with a flathead screwdriver or whatever you have that'll fit in here. Try not to break it. We have to add this to the new rotor. I like to clean off my e-brake shoes so that there's minimal dust left over, not just so that it doesn't become airborne, but also so that it's nice and clean when I reassemble everything. Hit the hub a little bit. We're going to clean it off, but get any old grease off of it. We will be recoating it. You can use a wire brush, a wire wheel, or if it's in really bad shape, you can use a sanding disc. Just make sure you don't remove material. All you want to do is clean it up so it's nice and flat so the new rotor can stay on here nice and flat. Otherwise, it will be at an angle, even with a little bit of rust here, and well, you'll have braking issues. Once you're done cleaning, rinse it off. Now let's clean up our bracket. First thing I'm going to do is remove the old anti-rattle clips. Sometimes these are stuck and you need something to pry them off of here. There we go. Once they're off, this area needs to be cleaned up so that it's, well, not perfect, but at least free of any rust buildup. It's important because if there is rust buildup here, it's actually going to crush the pads, top and bottom. They won't be able to slide smoothly. A wire brush looks like it's doing the trick very well for me. I'm not looking to get it shiny. I'm just looking to remove the rust buildup. However, if yours is in really poor condition, you're going to need to use a file or some sort of a sanding disc to get this nice and flat. But don't remove too much material, because if you do, pads can actually move around too much, and then you'll hear some noise. This is looking pretty good for me. I'm going to rinse it off with brake parts cleaner. Once it dries off, I'm going to put a little bit of silicone paste on this area. You can use brake grease if that's what you have. Basically, what you're looking to do is coat it with some sort of grease that is resistant to high temperature so that it doesn't continue rusting in the future. You just want a thin layer, because if you put too much, as soon as you put your anti-rattle clips on, it's actually going to squish out, get into the center part here, and get on your rotor, which is what you're trying to avoid. Putting the anti-rattle clips on, you want to make sure that they're centered, otherwise they won't go down. And then right in the center here, they have these tabs that have to lock in. That's going to be the tougher part, but once you get it pressed down, it should want to stay. This is seated nicely, so now flip it over, do the same to the other side. Now let's remove the slider pins and clean them up one at a time. That way they don't get confused. If yours are stuck in there, seized, try to unseize them by working them back and forth and then inspect them. No matter what, you want to inspect them, make sure they're good. This one's perfect. If they look like this, you can definitely reuse them. I had really good grease in there, so I'm not really worried about cleaning out the entire bore. I'm going to shove my rag in here just a little bit to pick up some of the old grease. But other than that, it looks really good. So what I'm going to do is actually add new grease. I'm going to take some on my brush. Not going to add this whole thing. That's a little much. But put a little bit in there and work it into the boot. This is going to act as a reserve of grease. Then I'm going to put some on the slider pin. You can't put too much on this because it'll just get wiped off as you insert it. There is grease on the edge of the boot here, which is perfect. It'll get on that ridge and seal everything up properly. Insert the pin, squeeze out all the excess air. Give it a couple twists to work that grease in. Make sure it slides smoothly, and do the same to the other one right over here. Now let's coat the hub in anti-seize. Just put a thin layer. Focus on this inner lip as well as the outer lip. In the center, I will cover it, but it's not as crucial because it doesn't actually touch the rotor. This is where it makes contact, and this is where it's going to seize. Get that nice and coated. I'm going to go on the outside, and then whatever's left on my brush, I'll put on the inside. Don't put too much, because if you put a lot, it's going to actually fling out on the rotor as you drive, and that is not good. It'll get on the area where the parking brake shoes ride, and well, they won't really hold very well anymore if it's all greased up. Also, try to avoid getting it on the lug studs. Those threads need to stay dry. Install the rotor backwards, and that is just so the hub can hold it for you so we can clean this surface. It is oiled up from the factory so it doesn't rust while on the shelf. And then we want to clean the braking surface as well as the parking brake shoe surface with brake parts cleaner and a clean rag. It is coated in oil and you want to get all that oil off. Not too worried about the lint that is being left behind. That's going to come right off. As long as it's degreased, that's what matters. Now flip it over, install it the correct way. The only thing you want to pay attention to is the set screws for the rotor. Make sure they line up with the holes on the hub. Don't put those in yet because we have to mount the caliper. But once it's on here, it's being held on, so you can clean the outer surface as well. This is also coated in oil, the whole thing is. There we go. Once you're sure this is clean, before we forget, let's put that little cover on. That's where you would adjust your parking brake shoes if you needed to, which we will check in a minute. But for now, I'm going to install that before it's too late. If your parking brake shoes were properly adjusted prior, they may not actually need to be adjusted at all at this point. And for me, holding the rotor on, I can just barely hear them touch at times. That's exactly what you want. If they're continuously scraping, they're too tight, and if they're not touching at all, they're too loose. So you'd want to take the rotor off, and at the bottom there will be an adjuster, or you can reach it right through this little rubber grommet here and adjust the parking brake shoes accordingly. Like I said, mine are perfectly adjusted already. Slide the caliper bracket over the rotor, and it's going to be easiest if you line up the top bolt first. Thread on this lower bolt by hand. You should be able to give it a few spins, and you can also use some needle nose pliers. Usually if they are narrow enough on the end, you can get in here and basically turn the bolt like this a little bit at a time. Once you get it close to bottomed out, you should be able to stick that 14mm wrench back in here and finish it up the rest of the way. You cannot torque this bottom bolt unless you pull the control arm off. So the torque for these is between 47 and 54 foot-pounds. I'm going to torque the top one, but I cannot get to the bottom one, unfortunately. So right off the bat, I'm just going to make it nice and tight with my wrench. This is a fairly long wrench, so I am confident that I can put 50 foot-pounds into the bolt here. There we go. And now grab a socket, thread on the top one. Make it snug. I can torque this one. I'm going to go for 50 foot-pounds. That's it right there. To install the pads, you want to make sure that the inner pad has the wear indicator on it. That goes on the bottom of the caliper bracket. And you can put the bottom side of the pad in and then kind of angle it, slide the top in as well. The pads should slide around smoothly, just like this. If they are stuck and take a lot of force or they don't go in easily, most likely that's because you didn't clean up these areas. And like I was saying earlier, the pads are getting crushed in between. That will make your brakes hang up. So you definitely want to take this off and do some more cleaning. Use a 10mm wrench, open up the bleeder screw again. It shouldn't be too difficult now that it's already been opened. And use a caliper depression tool or piston depressor. This is what it looks like. It pushes in on the piston. I'm going to hold the bleeder screw up so the fluid can come out through the bleeder screw without any air getting in. Depress it slowly until it is completely retracted. Once you're done, clean off this area so that there's no residual fluid on the caliper. You don't want to confuse it for a potential leak. Now, slide the caliper over the pads. It should fit on nicely. And let's get the two bolts back in. Thread these on by hand. And the torque for these is between 16 and 23 foot-pounds. I'm just going to go for 20. It's right about in the middle. That's 20 on one. If your slider pin is spinning while you're trying to do this, you can hold it with a wrench or some pliers. Just be very careful if you end up using pliers. You don't want to damage the boot. And that's two. Reinstall the two fasteners that hold the rotor onto the hub. I prefer to put a little bit of anti-seize on those threads just so that they don't get stuck in the future. Snug them up. Don't make them too tight though. At this point, if you feel like you had air in it and you want it to do more gravity bleeding, open the bleeder screw back up. I am certain that there is no air left in my system, so I'm going to put the bleeder screw cap back on, and then we can get the wheel on. Install the wheel. Thread on all 5 of your lug nuts by hand. We'll bottom them out in a cross pattern, and then also in a cross pattern, you're gonna wanna torque these. The torque on these is between 65 and 80 foot-pounds. I'm just gonna go for 80. That way they're nice and tight and it's still within spec. So let's snug them up in a cross pattern. $80 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Double check them. There you go.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.